The dust of Redemption Creek usually carried the scent of dry earth and faint, flickering hope. But on this blazing afternoon, it was thick with something far uglier, a tension sharp and brutal, like a fresh wound. Right there, in the heart of town, a storm was brewing. A ring of townsfolk, their faces a mixture of scorn and cruel curiosity, had encircled Aiyana, a woman of the people. Her dark braids shone, her posture proud, yet she stood utterly alone, enduring a venomous tirade from one particularly loud, florid-faced man. Her humiliation was a spectacle, raw and public. From the shaded overhang of the blacksmiths, a young cowboy named Caleb watched, a familiar cold not tightening in his stomach. He knew this kind of silence from a crowd, the silence that eagerly awaited a spark. And he knew, with a certainty that bit deep, that this was the kind of injustice that could swallow a soul whole if someone didn't stand against it. Someone was about to make a choice that would shatter the ugly peace, and Caleb felt the pull, the undeniable urge to be that someone, to utter the words that would change everything. Caleb was not a man who sought the center of things. He'd arrived in Redemption Creek months earlier, a quiet drifter who found work at the Miller Ranch, his days spent mending fences and tending stock, his nights often spent alone, under the vast, indifferent stars. He was young, lean, with hands calloused by labor but surprisingly deft. The other ranch hands, noting the unusual longbow and quiver that were always among his few possessions, had taken to calling him Bowboy. It wasn't a name said with much respect, more with a kind of dismissive curiosity. Caleb never offered an explanation for the bow, nor for the quiet watchfulness in his eyes. His past was a landscape he preferred to keep hidden, its paths best left untrodden by others. He'd learned that peace, the fragile kind he craved, was often found in anonymity. He had seen Aiyana in town before. Her visits were infrequent, solitary affairs, undertaken to trade essential goods. She moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to both impress and unsettle the townsfolk. Whispers always trailed in her wake, like dry leaves skittering before a storm. Redemption Creek was a place that tolerated her presence, but tolerance was a thin, brittle thing, easily shattered by the old fears and unhealed grudges that lay just beneath the surface of frontier life. The clanging of the farrier's hammer, the rumble of wagons, the distant, tinny piano from the saloon, these were the sounds of a town trying to convince itself of its civility. But Caleb sensed the unease, the constant, low thrum of potential conflict with the native tribes whose ancestral lands pressed close. Men like Bartholomew Higgins, they didn't just sense that unease. They cultivated it, nurtured it for their own gain. Caleb had observed Higgins before, his bluster, his greed, the way he treated anyone he considered beneath him. He knew the type. This particular morning, Aiyana had entered the general store, her purpose clear. She carried a bundle of finely tanned hides and intricately beaded moccasins. Her people faced a lean season, and the flour, salt, and medicine she hoped to acquire were not mere commodities, but survival itself. The bell above the mercantile door jingled, a deceptively cheerful sound announcing her arrival into a space already occupied by trouble in the form of Bartholomew Higgins. Higgins, his bulk straining the seams of an overly formal suit, his face perpetually flushed with self-importance, spotted Aiyana immediately. His small, greedy eyes narrowed. He owned a significant parcel of land bordering the tribal territories, and his desire for more, particularly for the water rights of the Whisperwind Creek, was an open secret. Higgins' voice, loud and aggressive, sliced through the store's quiet murmur. "Well, well, what have we here?" he boomed, his gesture dismissive. "Come to look around, have you? See what you can pilfer when backs are turned?" Aiyana faced him, her expression unreadable, though a keen observer might have seen the tightening around her eyes. "I come to trade," she stated, her voice low but carrying. "Trade," Higgins scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "Or to spy for your thieving kind. We've had cattle go missing from my north pasture. Funny you show up today, isn't it?" The accusation, baseless and vile, hung heavy in the air. Other customers paused, their initial curiosity morphing into suspicion as Higgins sowed his poison. Peterson, the storekeeper, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, wrung his hands but remained silent. Higgins had that effect on people. Caleb had entered the mercantile moments before, needing supplies for the Miller Ranch. He stood near the rear of the store, by the tools and hardware, an unintentional witness. He saw the flash of alarm in Aiyana's eyes, quickly shuddered. He saw the predatory light in Higgins, the man clearly relishing the power his attack afforded him. The atmosphere grew stifling, charged with the town's latent prejudice, eager to find a focus for its anxieties. Higgins, sensing he had an audience, pressed his vile advantage. He raised his voice, ensuring his words carried beyond the mercantile doors to the small crowd already gathering on the boardwalk. "This thievery," he proclaimed, "it has to end. These savages think they can just walk in and take whatever they please." He jabbed a thick finger towards Aiyana. "I say we search her right now. See what else she's got hidden." Aiyana clutched her bundle of trade goods, her only shield. "I have stolen nothing," she insisted, her voice strained but firm. "My people are honorable." "Honorable?" Higgins let out a harsh, barking laugh. "That's rich. Sheriff," he bellowed, knowing full well Sheriff Brody was likely at the far end of town, or perhaps deliberately making himself scarce. Brody was a man who preferred the path of least resistance, especially when it meant confronting a man of Higgins' local standing. The crowd outside the mercantile swelled, faces pressed against the glass, expressions ranging from grim to expectant. Higgins, fueled by the attention, grabbed Aiyana's arm. "Let's just see what you're carrying, girl." Aiyana recoiled, her composure finally showing cracks. "Do not touch me," she cried out. Caleb watched, his jaw clenching almost imperceptibly. His hand twitched, moving by instinct towards his hip, though he wore no sidearm. His skills lay with the bow, with patience, with the perfect release of an arrow after long, careful aim. This, however, was a different kind of battle, a slow, public stripping of dignity, a corrosion of the spirit. He saw the demeaning way Higgins' eyes raked over Aiyana, the open contempt. He heard the ugly murmurs from the crowd, "Savage, thief, send her back." A lanky youth, eager to earn Higgins' favor, jeered, "Maybe she needs a lesson in how we do things in town." Caleb took a small, almost invisible step. To intervene was to invite the very trouble he'd spent his life avoiding, to shatter the peace he so carefully guarded. Yet, to stand by, to witness this cruelty without lifting a finger, that felt like a betrayal of something fundamental within him. He remembered stories his grandmother told, tales of quiet courage in the face of loud injustice. He'd always thought them just stories. Until now. Higgins, enraged by Aiyana's resistance, gave her a violent shove. She stumbled, losing her balance, and her precious bundle of trade goods, the moccasins, the hides, her people's hope, tumbled to the dusty floorboards, scattering in a pathetic array. A small, choked sound escaped Aiyana, a sound of profound pain and humiliation. The crowd outside surged, a palpable wave of dark anticipation. Caleb knew, with cold certainty, that this was the precipice. The mob was a tinderbox, and Higgins was holding the match. He saw the smirk of triumph on Higgins' florid face. The degradation was complete, or so Higgins thought. He was turning Aiyana into an object, a focus for all their festering fears. Caleb's gaze met Aiyana's. For a fleeting instant, her eyes locked with his, and in their depths, he saw not just fear, but a desperate, silent appeal. It wasn't for rescue, not entirely. It was a plea for simple human decency in a place that seemed to have forgotten its meaning. That look, more than anything, ignited the slow-burning anger within Caleb. He'd seen bullies like Bartholomew Higgins his whole life. He understood their nature. They thrived on silence, on inaction. The final straw came when two of Higgins' burly ranch hands, who'd been loitering at the edge of the growing throng, shouldered their way into the store. They were hard-faced men, with mean eyes and the arrogant swagger of those who served a powerful master. "Mr. Higgins," one of them drawled, his knuckles cracking ominously. "You want us to escort the lady out?" The unspoken threat in his tone was unmistakable. It would be no gentle removal. Higgins nodded, his lips curling into a satisfied smile. "See that she learns a lesson," he instructed, "and make sure she doesn't come back to Redemption Creek." The two men advanced on Aiyana. She stood frozen, the scattered moccasins at her feet a poignant symbol of her broken mission. The crowd outside leaned in, a collective intake of breath, hungry for the impending confrontation. This was it. The moment simmering prejudice would erupt into open violence. And then Caleb moved. He didn't shout. He didn't draw. He simply materialized from the shadows at the back of the store, his movement fluid and unexpectedly swift, taking everyone by surprise. He positioned himself directly between Aiyana and Higgins' advancing thugs. He was just one man, young, unassuming, the Bowboy as some called him. But there was a sudden, unyielding quality to his stance, a glint in his clear blue eyes, that made the two hardened ranch hands pause, their momentum broken. Higgins' face contorted with rage. "You, boy," he spat. "Get out of the way. This is none of your affair." Caleb's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, yet it sliced through the charged atmosphere like a razor. "She's not bothering anyone, Higgins. Not bothering anyone." Higgins sputtered, gesturing wildly. "She's a thief, a spy, and she's on my property." This last was a blatant lie. They were in the town's public mercantile, but Higgins was too consumed by his fury to care for truth. One of the thugs took a menacing step forward. "Last chance, kid," he growled. "Move aside." Caleb didn't flinch. His gaze, steady and direct, met the thug's. Then he turned his head just slightly, his eyes finding Aiyana, who looked back at him, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning hope. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise. Then, looking squarely at Higgins and his glowering men, Caleb uttered the words that would hang in the air, that would be recounted around campfires and in hushed tavern corners for years to come. The words that defied the bully, challenged the mob, and drew a line in the dust of Redemption Creek. "She's with me." A profound silence descended upon the mercantile. It was as if the entire town held its breath. Outside, the faces pressed to the window registered shock. Higgins' jaw literally dropped. His two thugs stared, first at Caleb, then at each other, then back to Higgins, clearly uncertain how to react to this completely unexpected defiance. Behind Caleb, Aiyana slowly straightened her shoulders, a spark of resilience rekindling in her eyes. The quiet cowboy, the Bowboy, had just thrown down a challenge, and all of Redemption Creek waited to see it met. Bartholomew Higgins was the first to recover, his face mottling from red to a furious purple. "With you," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "And who in the hell are you, boy, to be concerning yourself with this squaw?" He spat the vile word, aiming to diminish both Aiyana and her defender. "Some drifting ranch hand. You think you can tell me what to do in my town?" Caleb remained rooted, his quiet demeanor now a formidable barrier. "This isn't your town, Higgins," he stated, his voice even but firm. "And her name is Aiyana." The simple act of using her name, of according her that basic human respect, seemed to stoke Higgins' fury to an even greater height. "I don't care what her name is," Higgins roared. "She's a thief, and she's no thief," Caleb interrupted, his calm voice carrying an undeniable authority. "The only thief I see in this room, Higgins, is you." A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. To openly accuse Bartholomew Higgins, the town's most influential and feared citizen? It was unthinkable. Higgins himself looked as if Caleb had physically struck him. What did you say?" he stammered, his usual bluster faltering for a moment. "You heard me," Caleb continued, his gaze unwavering. "Aiyana didn't come here to steal. She came because her people are desperate. And they're desperate because you, Higgins, have been methodically trying to cut off their access to Whisperwind Creek." The crowd murmured. Everyone knew of Whisperwind Creek. It was the lifeblood of the northern lands, including the ancestral territory of Aiyana's tribe. Higgins blanched. That's a ridiculous lie. Is it? Caleb's eyes narrowed. I've been working up at the Miller Ranch, not far from your northern range lines. I've seen the new fences you've been erecting, Higgins. Fences that creep further onto tribal land with each passing week. Fences that block access to the creek. I've even heard your own men joking about your plan to, as they put it, starve him out, so you can claim that water entirely for yourself. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Caleb wasn't just some do-gooder. He possessed specific, damning information. He, the quiet Bowboy, had been watching, listening, piecing together a truth no one else had bothered to seek. And I also know, Caleb pressed, his voice gaining a resonant strength, that Aiyana came to town today hoping to find Sheriff Brody, to plead for fair arbitration, to show him documented proof of your encroachment. She was carrying maps, Higgins, not stolen goods. He gestured towards the items, still scattered on the floor. Those beautiful hides and moccasins, they were intended as gifts, tokens of peace and goodwill for the sheriff, to demonstrate good faith. Aiyana stared at Caleb, her eyes wide with astonishment. How could he possibly know all this? She had indeed carried a tightly rolled parchment map within her bundle, a map she now feared was lost or destroyed in the scuffle. Higgins was sputtering, his face a mask of disbelief and cornered rage. Lies. All lies. This young pup is crazy. He's in league with them. But Caleb's words, spoken with such quiet certainty, had planted seeds of doubt within the crowd. Townsfolk began to exchange uneasy glances. They all knew of Higgins' insatiable greed, his relentless ambition. Caleb's accusation, however shocking, carried the uncomfortable ring of truth. If they're lies, Higgins, Caleb challenged, then let's find out. Let Aiyana speak for herself. Let her present her map to Sheriff Brody. Unless you're afraid of what he might discover. The entire focus of the confrontation shifted. It was no longer about a lone native woman accused of a petty crime. It was now about a powerful, ruthless man accused of a far greater, more insidious offense, and about a young, unassuming cowboy who had dared to expose him. The Bowboy, it was becoming clear, had an arrow of truth aimed directly at Bartholomew Higgins' corrupt heart. Higgins, trapped and exposed, reverted to his most trusted weapons, brute force and bluster. Enough of this nonsense, he bellowed, his face a blotchy crimson. He jabbed a commanding finger at his two hired thugs. Get this interfering whelp out of my way, and deal with the woman. Do it now. The two men, momentarily thrown off balance by Caleb's revelations, exchanged a quick glance. Their loyalty was to Higgins' coin, however tarnished it might now seem. They squared their shoulders and began to advance once more, their expressions hardening into familiar menace. But the air in the mercantile had changed. Caleb's quiet courage, his devastatingly accurate accusations, had pricked the dormant conscience of some in the crowd. Old Man Hemlock, the town's grizzled and usually taciturn blacksmith, who had been observing silently from his nearby doorway, cleared his throat with a sound like stones grinding together. "Hold on there, boys," he rumbled, his voice carrying surprising weight. "Maybe the young fella has a point. Maybe we ought to hear what the lady has to say." A ripple of agreement spread through a segment of the crowd. Mrs. Davies, the baker's wife, a woman known for her sharp wit and equally sharp sense of justice, chimed in. "That's right. Higgins has been coveting that creek water for years. It's no town secret." Higgins looked aghast, his composure crumbling. His iron grip on the town's opinion was visibly slipping. "You're taking the word of this drifter, this Bowboy over mine," he demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief and outrage. "He ain't just a drifter if he's speaking the God's honest truth, Mr. Higgins," came a surprisingly firm voice from the back of the mercantile. It was Peterson, the storekeeper, looking terrified but strangely resolute. "And that young woman, she's traded in my store before. Always been fair. Always been honest." Caleb remained still, a silent anchor in the storm. He didn't need to speak further. His intervention had empowered others, given them the courage to find their own voices against the town's longtime bully. The two thugs hesitated again, their eyes flicking from Higgins to the increasingly vocal townsfolk. It was one thing to manhandle a lone, defenseless woman with the tacit approval of the crowd. It was quite another to push against a growing tide of dissent. At that precise moment, Sheriff Brody finally made his appearance, drawn by the sustained uproar. He was a portly man, his face perpetually etched with an expression of mild, overwhelmed confusion. "What in tarnation is all this ruckus about?" he puffed, his gaze sweeping from Higgins' furious face to Caleb's calm one, and finally to Aiyana. Higgins saw his chance to regain control. "Sheriff," he exclaimed with feigned relief, "thank goodness you're here. Arrest this woman immediately. She's a thief, and this young fool is obstructing justice." But before Sheriff Brody could formulate a response, Caleb spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Sheriff, Aiyana came to Redemption Creek to see you. She possesses evidence that Mr. Higgins is illegally encroaching on her people's ancestral lands and actively attempting to steal their vital water rights. She was assaulted and falsely accused before she even had a chance to speak with you." Sheriff Brody looked from Caleb's earnest expression to Higgins' apoplectic one, then to Aiyana, who now stood with a fragile but renewed dignity, her eyes fixed on him. He noted the scattered moccasins, the shifting, now sympathetic faces in the crowd, the way Higgins' men still seemed poised for violence. For perhaps the first time in his tenure, the sheriff appeared to realize he was facing something more significant than a minor disturbance. "Well, Higgins," Brody asked, his tone notably lacking its usual deference, "what do you have to say to these accusations?" Higgins blustered. "It's all lies, Sheriff. Preposterous lies. He has no proof." "Aiyana has a map, Sheriff," Caleb stated calmly, "and I am a witness to Mr. Higgins' threats and his men's aggressive actions." He then looked directly at Aiyana. "Show him the map, Aiyana." Aiyana bent down and carefully retrieved a crushed, but still legible, roll of parchment from where her bundle had fallen. She held it out toward Sheriff Brody. Higgins lunged. "Give me that document." But Caleb, anticipating the move, was quicker. He didn't draw a weapon, but he moved with a startling, economical speed, once again interposing his body. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to clamp down firmly on Higgins' outstretched arm. "I don't think so, Higgins." Caleb's grip was like a vice. Higgins, shocked by the unexpected strength in the younger man, yelped in pain and stumbled back, his face contorted. The Bowboy was clearly more than just a quiet ranch hand. There was a coiled power in him, a practiced readiness that spoke of a life lived beyond mending fences. Sheriff Brody accepted the map from Aiyana. He unrolled it carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration as he studied the meticulously drawn lines, symbols, and annotations. The mercantile, and indeed the street outside, fell into a hushed, expectant silence. After what felt like an eternity, Brody looked up, his gaze hardening as it settled on Higgins. "This map seems remarkably clear, Bartholomew," he said slowly, "and it corroborates certain whispers I've been hearing around town myself lately." The fight visibly drained out of Higgins. His face, moments before flushed with rage, turned a sickly, pasty white. He looked around wildly, searching for support in the faces of the townsfolk, people who had once eagerly followed his lead, or at least feared to cross him. He found no solace there now, only varying degrees of condemnation, disgust, and dawning understanding. His power, built on a foundation of bluster, intimidation, and ill-gotten influence, had crumbled under the weight of one young man's courage and the undeniable truth. I. Higgins stammered, but no coherent defense, no plausible excuse, came. Sheriff Brody let out a heavy sigh. "Bartholomew Higgins," he said, his voice finally carrying the full authority of the law, an authority he sometimes seemed reluctant to wield. "I believe you, and I need to have a very long, very serious conversation down at my office." about these new fences of yours, and about disturbing the peace, and assault. He then gestured curtly to Higgins' two bewildered thugs. You two as well. Come along quietly. The two ranch hands, their earlier bravado completely gone, looked like deflated balloons. They offered no resistance as the sheriff, with a newfound and surprising resolve, gestured them towards the door. Higgins, utterly defeated and profoundly humiliated, was prodded along, the scornful looks and derisive murmurs of the crowd following him like a swarm of angry hornets. Justice in Redemption Creek had taken a sharp, unexpected, and deeply satisfying turn. With Higgins and his cronies marched off by the sheriff, a collective exhalation, a shared sigh of relief, seemed to pass through the mercantile and the assembled crowd outside. Aiyana, her shoulders finally unburdening themselves of a tremendous weight, turned to Caleb. Her dark eyes, luminous and clear, conveyed a profound gratitude that transcended the need for spoken words. She slowly bent, her movements regaining their natural grace, and began to gather her scattered moccasins and hides from the dusty floorboards. Caleb knelt beside her, helping to collect the precious items, the tension he had carried for what felt like an eternity now easing, replaced by a quiet sense of rightness. Several townsfolk, their faces now etched with a mixture of shame for their earlier complicity and a newfound respect for both Aiyana and Caleb, stepped forward to assist. Mrs. Davies, the baker's wife, clucked sympathetically as she picked up a particularly fine pair of beaded slippers. "These are truly beautiful, child," she said softly, her tone gentle. "Too beautiful to be treated with such disrespect." Old man Hemlock, the blacksmith, let out a grunt that, from him, amounted to high praise. "That Bowboy, he's got more sand than half this town put together." The name Bowboy, which had once been a casual, slightly mocking moniker, now carried an undertone of genuine admiration. Once her belongings were carefully repacked, Aiyana faced Caleb directly. "You spoke truth for me when no one else dared," she said, her voice low but imbued with a powerful sincerity. "My people will not forget this day. I will not forget this day." She paused, then added, "The name Caleb will be an honored one spoken in our lodges." A warmth spread through Caleb, a sensation he hadn't realized he had been missing for so long. "Just did what anyone ought to have done, ma'am," he replied, a little uncomfortably, and used to such open expressions of gratitude. Sheriff Brody returned a short while later, looking weary, but also more resolute than Caleb had ever seen him. "Aiyana," he said, addressing her with a newfound respect that had been glaringly absent before, "your map and Mr. Caleb's testimony, well, let's just say Mr. Bartholomew Higgins will be far too preoccupied with legal entanglements to cause any further trouble for your people up at Whisperwind Creek. I'll be riding out that way myself in a day or two to personally supervise the removal of those illegal fences." Aiyana inclined her head, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied. "That is all we ever asked for." Redemption Creek was quiet as dusk began to settle, but it was a different quality of quiet than before. It was the quiet of introspection, of a community that had been forced to look at an ugly part of itself and, spurred by the courage of an unassuming outsider and the quiet dignity of a wronged woman, had chosen a better path. Bartholomew Higgins' reign of intimidation was broken, his pervasive greed laid bare for all to see. The town would not soon forget the day the Bowboy stood tall. Caleb didn't linger in the newfound limelight. He walked with Aiyana to the edge of town, to where the trail branched off towards her people's lands. As she prepared to depart, she pressed a small, intricately carved wooden hawk into his hand. "A token," she explained, her eyes meeting his, "for courage, and for listening with an open heart when others would not." He closed his hand around the carving. The smooth would warm against his calloused palm. He knew, as he watched her disappear into the fading light, that he wouldn't simply be the quiet, anonymous ranch hand anymore. He had drawn a line, and in doing so, had revealed a strength within himself he had long kept carefully hidden. Perhaps, he mused, True peace wasn't merely about the absence of conflict, but about the willingness to stand for what was right, no matter how difficult the path. As the last vestiges of the sun dipped below the western horizon, painting the vast sky in dramatic hues of orange, purple, and deep indigo, Caleb turned back towards Redemption Creek. The dust had finally settled. The air, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, tasted a little cleaner, a little more hopeful. The trail ahead remained uncertain, as all trails in the West were, but he walked it with a lighter step, the heavy cloak of his past feeling just a little less burdensome, its weight subtly lessened by the quiet strength of a battle hard fought and justly won. Not with a gun, nor even with his bow, but with unwavering truth and a steadfast, courageous heart.